What is up, y'all? Proof of Workforce Live, the place where workers and wage earners grab Bitcoin signal. The Bitcoin Strategic Reserve is here. What does it mean? What does the IMF think about this? And who has the most Bitcoin per capita? That's BPC. What's happening in the world of workers, pension funds, and nation states? Let's punch your time cards, clock in. This is Proof of Workforce Live. We're going to kick off with the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. It's here. Jacob, take us there.
President Trump signing an executive order, we've been talking about it, to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Mackenzie Sagalos joins us now with more. We talked about it earlier, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but it was in the teleprompter, so it must be true. But it was disappointment about some details of the Bitcoin reserve caused Bitcoin to go down yesterday.
Yeah, the crypto market has been plunging since last night on that.
We know that it was because of what they said, or I mean, Bitcoin, moves 30% when it does that in its sleep sometimes, over a period. Was there disappointment? If so, what was the disappointment?
The big expectation was that we would see some sort of Bitcoin purchasing plan in tandem with the announcement of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. But the language in that executive order was very specific about it just meaning that we would hold on to what was already seized in criminal operations rather than roll out any sort of taxpayer dollars into a buying scheme.
Who wants that? No one.
Okay, so this is wild, and I gotta say myself, what a roller coaster it was for the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. Shout out to everyone who worked on it. Um, this thing comes out, and Bitcoin's price moves down, and they're talking about on MSNBC disappointment. How blessed we've become and spoiled in Bitcoin achievements that the Strategic Reserve can meet some disappointment. But let's take a look at this thing and how far we've come. We came a long way from the crypto post on Truth Social from the president, which kind of had me and many others thinking, like, is this real? We don't like, are they going to actually pull this off? Had a lot of doubts. But let's look at the Strategic Reserve executive order. Here it is pulled up. This thing, you have to read it. Don't trust the news, trust the source, and just really take a moment and pause to think about what has just happened. In an executive order from the President of the United States, arguably the most powerful country on the planet, it says the Bitcoin protocol permanently caps the total supply of Bitcoin at 21 million coins and has never been hacked. 21, will you do something for me? This executive order is chocked full of very solid Bitcoin language and explanations. It differentiates between the Bitcoin reserve and the stockpile, which is other cryptos. I think if you are someone who has studied and learned about Bitcoin over the last several years, you are very happy with this delivery and execution of this strategic reserve. The market just doesn't understand what has happened yet. There's all kind of reasons. Who knows? Maybe retail has a little bit of bad taste in their mouth from the old Trump and Melania coin. And maybe they just, who knows what's going on. Bitcoin is a massive asset with trillions of dollars in value. So it's quite a historical moment. You have to read the source. Read the source. And if you don't understand what it's saying in the executive order, go back and read the white paper. In fact, read the white paper and then read the executive order. This would be a good Saturday or Sunday exercise. We have a breakdown of kind of the events leading up to the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Shout out to Stephen Lubka. I thought he had a great little thread here. Talks about the week began with the president tweeting about XRP Sol and ADA. That's where I started getting very skeptic about whether this is actually going to pass, because how is the United States going to put something called Cardano or Solana on a strategic reserve? What changed? We scroll down and we have the tweet from Sunday, and it got a decent amount of backlash, as Stephen points out. Prices of the cryptos started ripping, of Ripple, Cardano, and Sol. Lots of chirping from Garlinghouse. And shortly thereafter, we had some basically negative info on Ripple and Sol, exposing some of the crypto shenanigans. Some of these folks had to come out and advocate for a non-crypto and Bitcoin only reserve. There's discussion about you see Donald Trump comes out and says, of course, Bitcoin and ETH are going to be on there 2 hours later. Prominent execs and donors, they start coming out saying, hey, this is a terrible idea to put these crypto tokens on. There's some things pointed out about Cardano and XRP donors. Sachs comes out and says, I don't have a conflict of interest. Lutnick comes out and talks about the strategic reserve. Tons of work behind the scenes, of course, from folks like David Bailey and Cynthia Lummis, and a lot of Bitcoiners, probably to get in folks' ear. And ultimately, this thing comes out strong. And if there was a get off zero kind of initiative for a nation, I think they did pretty good. It doesn't use taxpayer money. It clearly lays out the fundamentals behind Bitcoin and why it's an asset worth protecting and holding for the long term. It also lays some opportunities for different administration positions to evaluate a budget neutral acquisition of Bitcoin. And it has a lot of good stuff in it. So huge round of applause to those that pulled it off. It was a roller coaster ride for us. Another thought on this is, what does the IMF think about this? The IMF recently inked a loan with El Salvador, and they demanded El Salvador roll back some key aspects of the Bitcoin legal tender law. Once again, read the source documents. There's a lot going on with that before you jump to a conclusion. But how's the IMF going to feel? And what is the IMF? What do they do? Here's a quick clip for those that are tuning in on what the IMF does. A little video here.
In fact, the IMF was founded in 1944, when World War II was still raging. Countries were keenly aware of the need for international cooperation, including an international organization to promote economic and financial stability. Think of the IMF as one big credit union, where our member countries deposit their resources and from where they can also borrow.
So the IMF, one big credit union for the world that does a whole lot of stuff. That's a very quick video, and the IMF does a lot more. But is provide loans to different countries throughout the world. What role does the United States play in the IMF? I was curious, and so I looked it up. What I found out was that the United States is the largest shareholder and contributor to the IMF. It has a unique role because of the size of its voting power and its position. It has the largest quota and voting power in the IMF. The U.S. has a seat on the IMF's executive board, which makes decisions on policy, lending, and other matters. The U.S. has veto power over major IMF decisions. The U.S. has contributed around $117 billion to the IMF's quota and $44 billion to supplemental funds. The Secretary of Treasury is the U.S. governor to the IMF. The U.S. has a unique role in reforms. They veto a bunch of stuff, as we mentioned. And ultimately, you have the United States, pretty much a high-ranking participant of the IMF. In fact, if they pulled out of the IMF, I'd be real curious to see how that would impact the IMF overall. And the United States Executive Office just declared Bitcoin a digital asset worth holding and protecting for the long run. Lots of contradictions here now. So how does the IMF then go tell El Salvador, hey, you have to roll back your acquisition of Bitcoin? If I were Bukele, I would jump all over this. And there's a lot of hypocrisy going on at the IMF. I'll be curious to see how this impacts their stance moving forward. But meanwhile, nations continue to acquire Bitcoin. The nation state adoption cycle, I don't know, kind of with the strategic reserve, it's here. And so we now have a nation state adoption cycle simultaneously with an ongoing institutional cycle. And it's wild, and who knows what can happen. So we talked about in a last post, I talked about Bitcoin per capita. It's not about how much Bitcoin you have. I got a little shout out on Swan Signal for a humble pleb like me. This was a crazy moment. Let's roll that, Jacob, and see what is BPC, Bitcoin per capita.
I also like Don Bay's calculations. He's kind of looking at sovereign wealth funds, and you see things like how much wealth is in the sovereign wealth fund per citizen, right? So you can have a Sats per citizen metric coming out here. I think that's a pretty interesting way to look at this. Because, yeah, the US has a lot of Bitcoin, but per citizen, not as much as the country of Bhutan. Better check my math on that, but, you know.
Wouldn't surprise me at all.
Shout out to Brandon Quidham for just showing that insane love there. And yeah, and everyone else on the show, and that's Brady and Lynn, and it's just a fam there. So BPC rating, what is Bitcoin per capita? I'm going to pull up right here. We can see it in the left-hand corner there. So this is the amount of Bitcoin a nation holds divided by its population, really judging a concept of how much Bitcoin wealth does a country have. Bhutan is the heavyweight champion of this. And again, these numbers, I was on a panel with Samson Mao down in El Salvador. These numbers can vary, so I do not stand behind these being the most updated numbers. Also, I ran these calculations just like about a month ago, so the dollar amount may vary, but this was done a month ago. And at that time, on several sites, Bhutan was reported to have 13,000 Bitcoin. They have a population of 787,000. That means they have 0.0165184 Bitcoin per citizen, or a US dollar value of $1,730. The next country behind them is Ukraine. They talked about this on Swan Signal. How did countries get their Bitcoin? Bhutan mined a whole lot of Bitcoin from 2020. I encourage you to go look up that story. Al Jazeera did a little special on their whole Bitcoin story, worth watching. Ukraine got a lot of Bitcoin donated once the war broke out, and I don't know how else they acquired other Bitcoin. They're the next up, and they have 0.00125 Bitcoin per citizen in a country of 37 million. That's $130. So Bhutan has literally 17 times the amount of Bitcoin per citizen as the next ranking country as far as Bitcoin per citizen. El Salvador doing well. They're at just like $100 worth of Bitcoin per citizen at 0.0009. UK follows that. US is last. So we got our work cut out. And in fact, in order to catch up to Bhutan, US would have to hold roughly over 5 million Bitcoin. So there's some debate how much they have, whether it's like closer to 100,000 or 200,000 Bitcoin. But if Bitcoin wanted to surpass Bhutan in the BPC rating, that's Bitcoin per capita, they would have to acquire 4,800,000 Bitcoin plus. That's a lot of stacking that has to be done. Good luck to the administration. But, U.S. has a much bigger population. China has a lot of Bitcoin, but their population at 1.4 billion is massive. So they have some stacking to do as well. Again, remember, like the executive order says, Bitcoin supply is fixed at 21 million. A handful of coins have been lost. And so scarcity is real. It is a very important facet of Bitcoin. It can't be diluted. There can't be more shares. There's no stock splits. It's 21 million, y'all. Won't you do something for me? So it is what it is. So keep your eye on that BPC rating, Bitcoin per capita. It's an interesting one to look at aside from just how much Bitcoin a country has. Let's get to the proof of workforce update. Speaking of the IMF, they just put out a report, Global Financial Stability Notes, Pension Funds and Financial Stability. You can find this online. The IMF rips out a ton of different reports. And one thing that I found interesting, in addition to many things in this report, is it talks about pension funds and risks being faced, or emerging risks being faced by pension funds. And while talking about a shift in pension funds from defined benefit, which means that when you retire, you get a certain amount guaranteed, to defined contribution, which is a pension system where you make contributions and you retire with whatever the fund has. They had a little footnote on the deferred contribution plans saying that while the investments of defined contribution plans have been made mainly into transparent and plain vanilla instruments, such as mutual funds of listed equities and public bonds, defined contribution plans are increasing their asset allocations into illiquid and risky investments, including crypto exchange traded funds. See chapter 1 of a report they did. They refer back to that, titled "Pension Funds Dabble in Tokens After Bitcoin Surge." So the theme of this show has been contradiction and a little bit of hypocrisy. But just remember, you got to make up your mind for yourself, and you got to do your own homework and do your due diligence. You have the White House saying Bitcoin is a very powerful asset worth holding as a reserve asset for the United States of America. You have the IMF, for which the United States is the largest shareholder and contributor to the IMF, telling El Salvador, oh, you have to roll back your acquisition of Bitcoin, even though our largest shareholder and contributor to our whole organization just floated an executive order identifying Bitcoin as a keeper. Massive. And then you have the IMF putting out reports for pension funds, talking about how they're taking these illiquid, risky investment moves with the Bitcoin ETF. Tons of different messaging going on. You got to ask yourself why, and that's up to you to decide. I have my opinions, but you need to figure that out and just learn about Bitcoin and figure it out for yourself. So next week, tons of updates for Proof of Workforce. We have multiple unions coming online that have stepped into adopting Bitcoin. And we may have some other interesting news. I'm not going to go announcement before the announcement. I'm not doing that. Put your pitchforks down. This isn't an announcement. It's not a pre-announcement. I'm just saying notifications on next week. And we have some good, cool things coming out of Proof of Workforce. So make sure you guys are tuned in. We'll probably do a live show, and we'll have some posts that are going to announce kind of what unions have just entered the Bitcoin ecosystem. Self-custody rules to live by, to wrap us up. Again, this week's self-custody rule to live by is brought to you by La Rocca's Corner, one of San Francisco's oldest neighborhood bars, a great place to go drink and lose your Bitcoin, with a Bitcoin-friendly bartender and maybe kind of friendly patrons, although you're going to have to go figure that out for yourself and just, bring respect into the local bar, and respect you shall receive. And also don't drink, because drinking sucks. But yeah, tip for today for self-custody, which we always recommend that workers and wage earners learn. Before you transfer Bitcoin to your hardware wallet, wipe it and restore it from your seed phrase. And use small amounts to test your setup. This is something that's really important. Don't rush. Just because something is uncomfortable and you're not used to self-custody and storing your own seed phrase and handling a device that's a signing device, just know this becomes very easy and second nature over a few uses. It doesn't take much. You don't start off by transferring your entire Bitcoin holdings into self-custody, and that's the first time you'd use it. Look, I'm a firefighter, and the first time I used a chainsaw to ventilate a roof on a fire wasn't the first time I used a chainsaw. This would be a very, 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 very dangerous and bad idea. So don't do it. Get comfortable handling self-custody. Use small amounts. You can do it with $5 and send it back and forth. Pass the Bitcoin, get it to a different wallet, test it, send it back. Wipe your seed phrase, restore your seed phrase. Now you don't have to be scared and afraid. and over a time frame like weeks to months, you will feel so comfortable with self custody that you'll be able to do it while on the phone or watching a YouTube video or whatever. I don't recommend that. But again, what I'm saying is that you're going to become very comfortable with it. So, self custody is a journey, not a destination. And it is something worth learning no matter where you sit in your organization or as a worker or whether you're going to hold the ETF. Learn self custody. It's mandatory. So that's all for today. Thank you for tuning in to Proof of Workforce Live. I'm Don Bay. We are clocking out for the day. Punch your time cards, stay humble, stack sats, and remember, if you're going to trade your time for money, make sure that your money holds up over time. Y'all have a great weekend, and we will catch you. Alema will be on tomorrow, and we'll catch you next week with a symphony of drops and updates. So have a good one. Later, y'all.